So in the last video, I posed these questions to you guys, but this video is going to start answering them. So again, I would recommend that you pause, make sure you have these questions in front of you. If you're taking notes, maybe making a study guide on a Google Doc, jot down these questions quickly before you continue. All right, so first, how is the EU similar and different to NAFTA and the US, and rather also the US? So first, let's compare the EU to NAFTA. So we know that most EU nations, with the exception of some, so again, worth reviewing this confusing little chart about the EU versus the Eurozone versus the EEA and so on. So again, remember that most EU nations have a common currency, right? That is the Eurozone. But NAFTA nations, by contrast, none of them have a common currency, right? So the US, Mexico, and Canada all use a different form of currency, so they have to exchange every time they trade, but they still have a tariff-free zone, right? But we should consider the ways in which then the EU has a further economic integration than the NAFTA countries do. Another difference between the EU and NAFTA is that NAFTA is just an agreement, but the EU is a distinct political entity and it has some unique governing bodies, right? It has things like the European Parliament, the European Council, and so on, and we're going to talk about that in the next video, the way in which the EU governs itself. So again, this shows signs that the EU is more integrated than NAFTA is. Also, the EU and NAFTA both act as trade systems, so that definitely is a huge similarity. They form large trading blocs and they allow the free movement of goods. But NAFTA does not allow the free movement of people. So that's another difference, and that's another sign that the EU is further integrated than NAFTA. But in terms of the EU and the US is more integrated, and that shows signs, just like in the Khan Academy review video that you definitely should have watched, that the US is an example of a federation, whereas most people place the EU in more of a category of a confederation. So make sure you understand the differences between those. So with the EU and the US, both have mostly a common currency, although again, remember that not all EU countries are in the Eurozone, but all US states have a common currency, right? And also, not all EU countries are in the Schengen Agreement, so not all EU countries just freely travel free of passports, although most do, but all US states you can just travel across the border without showing any passport or national identity, right? There are some common laws throughout the entire confederation of the EU, although they are not as closely politically integrated as the US. The US does still have some independent state sovereignty, and so that shows us that there is some ability to govern more locally and nationally in both the EU and the US. And then again, another difference is that the EU does not have a common executive. So the US has a president, right? And also the EU does not have a common military, but the US does. Right, so again, we see, at least in terms of comparing the EU and the US is more integrated, whereas comparing the EU and NAFTA, the EU is more integrated. All right, so let's talk about how the EU evolves over time, right? That at the beginning, in 1950, it was just a very small economic integration called the European Coal and Steel Community. The reason why they formed shortly after World War II was to try to prevent future conflict. They surmised that if there was an economic union between nations, that it would be less likely that they would conflict and fight with each other, which has indeed proved to be the case because we haven't seen a major war break out throughout Europe since World War II, right? In 1957, the Treaty of Rome further merged these Central European countries into the European Economic Community, or the EEC. And after that, we saw significant growth economically in the member nations, right? So, and that's because there was an elimination of tariffs, they became this joint trading bloc, and also the community's joint control of food production created a food surplus among the member nations. So consider how that made it more appealing for other nations to join the EEC, which we indeed saw happen in the 1970s when Denmark, Ireland, and the UK joined the EEC. And then the EEC becomes further integrated because then they start to adapt mutual environmental protection laws, which is really the next step that the EEC takes to joining even further. Then by the 1980s, Spain, Portugal, and Greece join, so we see signs of further enlargement. And then comes 1993, and the Maastricht Treaty turns the EEC into the EU. So then we have more Northern and European Central European countries join rather. You can see that if you've been watching this map evolve, right? Notice what happens in 1993. There go, right? So we see all these other nations join. Also, by the early 2000s, the euro is introduced, and most countries gradually adopt it. So again, in each of these steps, as we move from the top of this timeline down to the bottom, we see further integration over time. There is no official capital of the EU, but most people see the de facto capital as Brussels in Belgium because that's where most of the institutions are located, although we do see some also central activity in the city of Strasbourg, France. Then we have to sort of think to ourselves, all right, why would a nation maybe not want to join the EU? And why would a nation maybe want out? And so maybe as we see the EU expand increasingly over time, that might be a reason why certain nations like Britain decide that it is no longer an appealing community for them to be in. I highly recommend that you check out slide 22 and go back to the treaty handout because that'll further go over some of these treaties. So we need to think again how, when these treaties are adopted, did they strengthen the idea of the just European integration as a whole, and also the idea of interdependence, the idea that they also rely upon one another to thrive? What provisions of these treaties are most important to individual Europeans, and also which of these treaties was the most important in the development of the EU? All right. And so again, the first treaty that we want to talk about is the Treaty of Rome in 1997, right? This further integrates these regions economically by creating a mutual trading bloc, right? So the EEC allowed tariff-free trade across borders, and so that allowed much more economic growth over time, and that prompted other nations to want to join in the 1970s and 1980s. The next major treaty is the Maastricht Treaty. All right, why is that important? Well, first off, it finally establishes a lot of these major goals for further unification. They wanted to establish common foreign policy, common defense policy. They wanted to increasingly align their social and environmental policies. They also wanted to increasingly aid poorer member nations, and they wanted to create a common currency. And most, if not all, of these goals have been achieved, at least to a certain extent. We need to apply asterisks to some. So, for example, the common currency has not been adopted across the board, although it largely has. And then the limits to the European Union we see down here, right? It never has established a common military, and it also does not have common welfare or educational policies towards member states. The Lisbon Treaty is also an important one to consider. The most important clause in it was the Lisbon Treaty, and that was Article 50. And that says that any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. And again, the EU was the first and only member nation to trigger Article 50 with the UK Brexit vote. NATO, let's think about the overlap between NATO and the EU. So NATO was established back in 1949. It was an alliance between North American and European countries, right? It established collective defense, right? Most member states agreed to mutual defense in response to an attack by any external party. And the spending, just like the EU, is proportional to a country's GDP, right? So that means that the US is the biggest contributor to NATO. Right, and so let's think about similarities between the EU and NATO, right? Both of them use proportional spending contributions, so the larger economies contribute more. Both of them establish collective defense. Differences. NATO is only a military alliance, whereas the EU also has major economic integration, right? There's no economic integration between common NATO countries unless those common NATO countries also belong to the EU. The EU is also only Europe, right? So think about the extent to which the EU is sort of an answer to NATO. The US is the dominant power in NATO, whereas the EU gives Europe a stronger voice overall. And then lastly, let's just reflect before we move on to the next video, right? How does this all connect to community, right? Let's think about whether or not member nations need to like each other. Over time, as the EU has expanded, do all these nations necessarily get along, right? We need to consider that, think about the limits to that. Do communities always need to serve the same purpose, right? Are there different reasons why members of a community want to belong, right? Do some of them want to belong chiefly for the economic opportunities? Do some of them want to belong more for the military benefits, right? So do they all need to have the exact same goal? Are there some that do not contribute to this purpose but still considered members of the community? So maybe smaller nations that don't contribute enough economically. To what extent are they seen as full-fledged members? Or do some people maybe think of them more as fringe members? Does being a member of the community also come with major responsibilities? And so one question is, does everyone maybe contribute equally to those responsibilities? Also, are members of a community seen as partners in a common enterprise? All right, and this is actually the prompt for our TEA for the test. So maybe we should also sort of start evaluating the EU and whether or not it's a successful and strong community. And we're going to talk about that further as we move forward and talk about things like EU enlargement, talk about Euroscepticism, and also talk about Brexit. And so we could consider all these different things to be ways to stack our paragraphs for our TEA. So maybe one paragraph for your TEA, you talk about the different ways in which the EU is further integrated to maybe use as an example of how they are successful and strong. And then as you move forward, you can maybe add some exceptions and think about how EU enlargement and Euroscepticism and also Brexit challenge the notion that it is successful and strong. So let's take a pause. We'll move on to the next bit where we are discussing the ways in which the EU is governed. So stay tuned for that, and thank you.